in the chamber who would like to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 53 and the nays are 47. The amendment is tabled.
Waive the reading.
The Democratic leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. I send an amendment to the desk to provide for a vote of the Senate on any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents after the question period, and I waive its reading. You want it
Any
read?
objection to the waiving of the reading?
Object. Read it.
There is an objection.
I withdraw my waiver, request for a waiver.
Can he object? Does any senator have an objection to the waiving of the reading? There is an objection, yes. The clerk will read the amendment.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment number 1292. On page 3, line 8, strike 4 hours and insert 2 hours. On page 3, line 10, strike the question of and all that follows through rules on line 12. On page 3, line 14, insert any such motion after decide. On page 3, line 15, strike whether and all that follows through documents on line 17. On page 3, line 18, strike that question and insert any such motion. On page 3, line 20 through and 24, strike and the Senate shall decide after deposition which witnesses shall testify, and insert and then shall testify in the Senate.
The amendment is arguable by the parties for 2 hours, equally divided. Mr. Manager Schiff, are you a proponent or opponent? Mr. Cipollone, a proponent or opponent? We oppose it. Thank you. Mr. Schiff, you may proceed and may reserve time for rebuttal.
Senators, this amendment makes two important changes to the McConnell resolution. The first is the McConnell resolution does not actually provide for an immediate vote even later on the witnesses that we have requested. What the McConnell resolution says is that at some point after essentially the trial is over, after you've had the arguments of both sides, you've had the 16 hours of questioning, then there will be a debate as to whether to have a vote and a debate on a particular witness. So there's no even guarantee you're going to get a chance to vote on specific witnesses. All the resolution provides is you're going to get an opportunity to vote, to have a debate on whether to ultimately have a vote on a particular witness. This would strip that middle layer. It would strip the debate on whether to have a debate on a particular witness. If my counsel, my colleagues for the President's team are making the point, well, you're going to get that opportunity later. The reality is, under the McConnell resolution, we may never get to have a debate about particular witnesses. Now, you've heard the discussion of 4 witnesses tonight. There may be others that come to the attention of this body, if we're able to get documents, that we should also call. But will you ever get to hear a debate about why a particular witness is necessary? Well, you may only get a debate over the debate. And so this amendment would remove that debate over a debate regarding a particular witness. The other thing that this resolution would provide is that you should hear from these witnesses directly. The McConnell resolution says they'll be deposed, and that's it. Doesn't say you're ever actually going to ever hear these witnesses for yourself, which means that you, as the triers of fact, may not get to see and witness the credibility of these witnesses. You may only get to see a deposition or a deposition transcript or maybe a video of a deposition, I don't know. But if there's any contesting of facts, wouldn't you like to hear from the witnesses yourself and very directly? Now, the reason why it was done this way in the Clinton case, why there were depositions, and again, In the Clinton case, all these people had been interviewed and deposed or testified before. But the reason why it was done that way in Clinton is because of the salacious nature of the testimony. Nobody wanted witnesses on the Senate floor talking about sex. Well, as I said earlier, I can assure you that will not be the issue here. And so to whatever degree there was a reluctance in the Clinton case to have live testimony because of its salacious character, that is not an issue here. That is not a reason here not to hear from those witnesses for yourself. So this resolution makes those two important changes, and I would urge your support of it. And I yield, I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Cipollone?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Mr. Papira will argue this motion.
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, good morning. I will be very brief on this. We strongly oppose the amendment. We support the resolution as written. We believe that the resolution, as to the two areas that Manager Schiff discussed, the resolution appropriately considers those questions and strikes the appropriate balance in the Senate's discretion as the sole trier of impeachments. The rules in place here in the resolution are similar to the Clinton proceeding in that regard, in the sense that this body has the discretion as to whether to hear from the witness live, if there are witnesses at some point, or not. But more fundamentally, there's the preliminary question that has to be overcome, which is they will have 2 hours, 4 hours total, 2 hours for them, to try to convince you after the parties have made their presentation, which they will have 24 hours to do, as to whether or not the preliminary question of whether it shall be in order to consider and debate any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents. That was precisely the Clinton rules. That was, or it's actually stronger than the Clinton rules, I'm sorry, and those rules, as I've indicated before, passed 100 to 0. We think that the resolution strikes the appropriate balance, and we urge that the amendment be rejected. I yield my time.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Schiff, you have 57 minutes.
Don't worry, I won't use it. I would say only if there was any veneer left to camouflage where the President's counsel was really coming from, the veneer is completely gone now. After saying we're going to have that opportunity to have a vote on these witnesses later, now they're saying no, you're just going to have a vote on whether to debate having a vote on the witnesses. The camouflage was pretty thin to begin with, but it's completely gone now. No, what they really want is they want to get to that debate, that generic debate about whether to have a debate on witnesses, and have you voted down so you never actually have to vote to refuse these witnesses, although you've had to do that tonight. I don't see what that purpose serves, except, I suppose, to put one more layer in the way of accountability. But the veneer is gone. All this promise about you're going to get that opportunity is just a question of when. No. The whole goal is for you never get a chance to take that vote. And what's more, the vote on this resolution is a vote that says you don't want to hear from these witnesses yourself. You don't want to evaluate the credibility of these witnesses yourself. Maybe, just maybe, you'll let them be deposed, but you don't want to hear them yourself. You don't want to see these witnesses come in and put up their hand and take an oath. Now, I don't know what the rules of these depositions are going to be. Maybe the public isn't going to ever get to see what happens in those depositions. We released all the deposition transcripts from our depositions, those secret 100-person depositions. But we have no idea what rule they'll adopt for these depositions. Maybe the public will see them, maybe they won't, maybe you'll get to see them. I assume you'll get to see them. But at the end of the day, this is also a vote that you're going to have to cast that says, no, I don't want to hear them for myself. No, I don't want to evaluate their credibility for myself. This is, after all, only a vote, only a case, only a trial about the impeachment of the President of the United States. You have a bank robbery trial? You have a trial over somebody stealing a piece of mail? You're going to get live witnesses. But an impeachment of the President of the United States? No, we don't need to see their credibility. Is that really where we are here tonight? Is that what the American people expect of a fair trial? I don't think it is. I yield back.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
I move to table the amendment and ask for the ayes and noes.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Inze. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
Is there any senator in the chamber who would like to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The amendment is tabled. Democratic leader is
Chief
recognized.
Justice, I send an amendment to the desk to allow adequate time for written responses to any motions by the parties, and I ask that it be read.
The clerk will report.
Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment number 1293. On page 2, beginning on line 10, strike 11 a.m. on Wednesday, January 22, 2020, and insert 9 a.m. on Thursday, January 23, 2020. On page 2, line 15, strike Wednesday, January 22, 2020, and insert Thursday, January 23, 2020.
The amendment is arguable by the parties for 2 hours, equally divided. Manager Schiff, are you a proponent of this amendment?
Mr. Schiff.
Are you a proponent of this amendment?
I am a proponent, Mr. Chief Justice.
Mr. Cipollone?
Mr. Chief Justice, I'm an opponent.
Okay, Mr. Schiff, you may proceed and reserve time for rebuttal if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. This amendment is quite simple. Under the McConnell resolution, the parties file motions tomorrow at 9 a.m., written motions, that is, and the responding party has to file their reply 2 hours later. That really doesn't give anybody enough time to respond to a written motion. When the President's team filed, for example, their trial brief, it was over 100 pages. We at least had 24 hours to file our reply, and that's all we would ask for. In the Clinton trial, again, if we are interested in the Clinton case, they had 41 hours to respond to written motions. We're not asking for 41 hours, but we are asking for enough time to write a decent response to a motion. That's essentially it, and I would hope that we can agree at least on this. I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Sekulow?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate. So it seems like tomorrow is a day off, according to your procedure. Is that correct, Mr. Schiff?
I forgot the time.
Today is tomorrow, tomorrow is today. The answer is we're ready to proceed. We will respond to any motions. We would ask the chamber to reject this amendment.
59 minutes remaining, Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chief Justice, we yield back our time.
Thank you. The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I move to table the amendment.
Is there a sufficient second?
There is.
There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inzy, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Ms. Duckworth,
Is there any senator in the chamber who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The amendment is tabled. The Democratic leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, on behalf of Senator Van Hollen, I send an amendment to the desk to help ensure impartial justice by requiring the Chief Justice of the United States to rule on motions to subpoena witnesses and documents. I ask that it be read. This is our last amendment of the evening.
The clerk will report.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, for Mr. Van Hollen, proposes an amendment number 1294. On page 3, line 20, insert the presiding officer shall rule to authorize the subpoena of any witness or any document that a senator or a party moves to subpoena if the presiding officer determines that the witness or document is likely to have probative evidence relevant to either article of impeachment before the Senate after order.
The amendment is arguable by the parties for 2 hours, equally divided. Manager Schiff, are you a proponent or opponent of the motion?
Opponent.
Mr. Cipollone, are you a proponent or opponent?
An opponent.
Mr. Schiff, you may proceed and reserve time for rebuttal.
Senators, this amendment would provide that the presiding officer shall rule to authorize the subpoena of any witness or any document, excuse me, the presiding officer shall rule to authorize the subpoena of any witness or any document that a senator or a party moves to subpoena if the presiding officer determines that that witness is likely to have probative evidence relevant to either article of impeachment. It's quite simple. It would allow the Chief Justice, it would allow the senators, the House managers, the President's counsel to make use of the experience of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to decide the questions of the relevance of witnesses. And either party can call the witnesses. If we can't come to agreement on witnesses ourselves, it would pick a neutral arbiter, that being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And if the Chief Justice finds that a witness would be probative, that witness will be allowed to testify. Chief Justice finds their testimony would be immaterial, that witness would not be permitted to testify. Now, it still maintains the Senate tradition that if you don't agree with the Chief Justice, you can overrule him. You have the votes, you can overrule the Chief Justice and say you disagree with what the Chief Justice has decided. But it would give this decision to a neutral party. That right is extended to both parties. It will be done in line with the schedule that the Majority Leader has set out. It's not the schedule we want. We still don't think it makes any sense to have the trial and then decide on witnesses, but if we're going to have to do it that way, and it looks like we are, at least let's have a neutral arbiter decide, much as he may loathe the task, whether a witness is relevant or a witness is not. And we would hope that if there's nothing else we can agree on tonight, that we could agree to allow the Chief Justice to give us the benefit of his experience in deciding which witnesses are relevant to this inquiry and which witnesses are not. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Sekulow?
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, and with no disrespect to the Chief Justice, this is not an appellate court. This is the United States Senate. There is not an arbitration clause in the United States Constitution. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. We oppose the motion, the amendment.
We yield our time.
Mr. Schiff, you have 57 minutes remaining.
Well, this is a good note to conclude on because don't let it be said we haven't made progress today. The President's counsel has just acknowledged for the first time that this is not an appellate court. I'm glad we have established that. This is the trial, not the appeal. And the trial ought to have witnesses, and the trial shouldn't be based on the cold record from the court below because there is no court below, because as the counsel has just admitted, you are not the appellate court. But I think what we've also seen here tonight is they not only don't want you to hear these witnesses, they don't want to hear them live, they don't want you really to hear them deposed, they don't want a neutral justice to weigh in, because if the neutral justice weighs in and says, you know, pretty hard to argue that John Bolton's not relevant here, pretty hard to argue that Mick Mulvaney's not relevant here. I just watched that videotape where he said he discussed this with the president. They're contesting it, pretty relevant. And what about Hunter Biden? Hunter Biden is probably the real reason they don't want the Chief Justice to have to rule on the materiality of a witness, right? What can Hunter Biden tell us about why the president withheld hundreds of millions of dollars from Ukraine? I can tell you what he could tell us. Nothing. What does Hunter Biden know about why the president wouldn't meet with President Zelensky? He can't tell us anything about that. What can he tell us about these Defense Department documents or OMB documents? What can he tell us about the violation of the law and withholding this money? Of course, he can't tell us anything about that because his testimony is immaterial and irrelevant. The only purpose in calling him is to succeed in what they failed to do earlier in this whole scheme, and that is to smear Joe Biden by going after his son. We trust the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to make that decision, that he's not a material witness. This isn't like fantasy football here. We're not making trades, or we shouldn't be. We'll trade you one completely irrelevant, immaterial witness that allows us to smear the president's opponent in exchange for ones that are really relevant, that you should hear. Is that a fair trial? If you can't trust the Chief Justice appointed by a Republican president to make a fair decision about materiality, I think it betrays the weakness of your case. Look, I'll be honest, there's been some apprehension on our side about this idea, but we have confidence the Chief Justice would make a fair and impartial decision, that he would do impartial justice. And it's something that my colleagues representing the president don't. They don't. They don't want a fair judicial ruling about this. They don't even want one that you could overturn, because they don't want a fair trial. And so we end where we started, with one party wanting a fair trial and one party that doesn't. One party that doesn't fear a fair trial and one party that is terrified of a fair trial. I yield back.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I make a motion to table the amendment and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
Is there any senator in the chamber who would like to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The amendment is tabled.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
I'd like to say on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for your patience.
Comes with the job. Go, please.
On scheduling, assuming there are no more amendments, the next vote will be on adoption of the resolution. And then all senators should stay in their seats until the trial is adjourned for the evening.
The question occurs on Senate Resolution 483. There is a sufficient second? Okay. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Mr. Heinrich, no.
Is there a senator in the chamber who would like to change his or her vote? If not, the ayes are 53, the nays are 47. The resolution is agreed to. The majority leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the trial adjourn until 1 p.m. Wednesday, January 22nd, and that this order also constitute the adjournment of the Senate.
Without objection, so ordered. The Senate is adjourned.
The secondary audio circuit for the Reuters live service.
How are you? You got a hop in your step, Senator. You're ready to go. Wow. What'd you think?
You guys, get some sleep. You stay out all night.
We'll just continue staying out the whole time. People who would be worth it to make news. That they would, I think they would win. You know what I mean? says, doesn't seem like any of them want to talk, and our parties actually don't want them to, unless certain ones. I've worked at every day since December 27th.